They called her invisible. Not to her face, never to her face. But the whispers happened anyway, in break rooms and supply closets, the kind of talk that floated past her like she wasn't there. That was exactly how Natalie Hayes preferred it. Invisibility had kept her alive in Kandahar. Invisibility had kept her employed at Seattle General for 2 years. Invisibility was the price the Pentagon had named when they told her to disappear, and she'd agreed without hesitation. What they didn't know was that she'd been training for this kind of work her entire military career, the work of being seen without being noticed, of holding power without announcing it. What they didn't know was that the quiet nurse in the corner of the ER had held a scalpel under mortar fire. The laughter would come later. For now, there was only the fluorescent hum of Seattle General's midnight corridors and the weight of a folded flag in her locker. The staff parking lot at 4:45 in the morning was empty except for her aging Honda Civic and a black Mercedes that probably belonged to Dr. Pierce, the kind of car that announced its owner's confidence before he even arrived. Natalie pulled into her usual spot near the back, killed the engine, and sat in the dark for exactly 90 seconds. This was her ritual. 90 seconds of silence before the shift swallowed her whole. Rain hammered the windshield like applause no one had asked for, and she watched it streak the glass, thinking about how different water looked when it came from a sky that wasn't trying to kill you. She grabbed her bag, worn leather, older than her daughter, and stepped out into the downpour without hurrying. Running was a tell. Running meant something mattered. She walked through the rain as if it didn't dare touch her, her military-issue boots finding purchase on wet asphalt, the kind of boots that had walked through worse than a Colorado parking lot. Seattle General ER doors opened with a pneumatic hiss at 5:17 a.m. The smell hit first, antiseptic layered over stale coffee, the specific staleness that only came from a pot made at 3 a.m. by someone too tired to care. Natalie had learned to breathe it in without letting it settle. The morning shift was already moving, residents pushing charts, nurses calling out vitals, the organized chaos of a trauma center coming alive. She moved through it the way she moved through everything, silently, purposefully, her scrubs blending into the blue and teal landscape of the ER. No one greeted her. No one asked about her evening. That was fine. That was better than fine. A nurse at Seattle General had once tried to be friendly, and Natalie's single-word response, busy, had ended the attempt so thoroughly that the woman had transferred to pediatrics within 3 months. The locker room was empty at 5:23. That was the window. The night shift nurses had logged out, the day shift hadn't arrived yet, and the space was hers alone. Natalie opened her locker, number 47, middle row, right side, and looked at what waited inside. Her spare scrubs. Her phone on silent. A half-eaten granola bar from yesterday. And there, sitting on top of a folded surgical towel, the flag. 13 stars. A triangle of fabric folded with the precision that only a military funeral detail could achieve. Natalie's left hand rose to touch it, her fingers tracing the edges, and for a moment, just a moment, her jaw tightened enough to be visible. The flag came from the body of Sergeant David Carlson, who had died on her table in Kandahar 17 months ago with a compound fracture and too much blood loss and no way to save him with field hospital equipment in her hands. The Pentagon had given the flag to her at a ceremony she wasn't supposed to attend. They told her to keep it somewhere safe, somewhere that wouldn't draw questions. A locker at a civilian hospital in Colorado Springs seemed to fit the parameters of invisible. She touched it once more, her ritual before every shift, and closed the door with a soft metallic click. The locker was unremarkable. Dented. Scratched. Nothing to make anyone look twice. Just like her. Just like her scrubs, which had no stains and no personality. Just like her shoes, which were practical and worn and gave away nothing about the last 12 years of her life. She checked her watch, 5:28. 2 minutes to spare before the pre-shift huddle. Natalie walked back out to the ER with the same measured pace she'd used when entering, her presence moving through the space like water through a sieve, there but leaving no trace. The ER was properly awake now. The patient count had dropped from 6 overnight to 4, which meant someone had been discharged or transferred or, less pleasantly, had flatlined without recovery. The monitor stations beeped their steady rhythm, the sound of heartbeats translated into electronic pulses, and Natalie's own heart rate remained exactly 72 beats per minute. She'd learned to control that in her previous life. Control was currency. Dr. Pierce stood at the charge nurse station reviewing patient charts with the kind of intensity that meant he was looking for something. He always was. The man moved through Seattle General like he owned it, and the way the residents scattered when he approached suggested they believed it too. His white coat was immaculate. His tie was silk. His watch was something that cost more than Natalie's car, which was ironic because that watch never told better time than her $10 digital one. She watched him from her peripheral vision as she approached the huddle, not really watching, just noticing, the way someone notices clouds moving across a sky they're not looking at directly. Dr. Pierce looked up from a chart. His eyes, which were a pale gray-blue like a winter sky over Denver, fixed on Natalie for exactly 2 seconds before moving away. She didn't react. Reactions were tells. She'd been trained to hold her face like water holds glass, transparent but completely impenetrable. What Dr. Pierce saw was a competent nurse in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, someone who showed up on time and filed reports correctly and never complicated his mornings. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that the surgical scars on her hands had come from working without proper lighting, under artillery fire, holding people together with field supplies designed for situations that never appeared in civilian medicine. What he didn't see was the way her mind processed a trauma room in 2.3 seconds, cataloging patient vitals and resource allocation and priority hierarchy before anyone else in the building had finished reading the initial assessment. What he didn't see was that she moved through the ER with the efficiency of someone who'd triaged under fire, who'd made life-and-death decisions in real time, who understood that a second wasted was a patient lost. The morning huddle took 9 minutes. Dr. Pierce presented the 4 current patients with clinical precision, a 73-year-old with acute MI risk, an 18-year-old with a compound arm fracture post-MVA, a 42-year-old with what they suspected was gallstone pancreatitis, and a 5-year-old brought in after a fall from a jungle gym with possible liver contusion. Standard morning. Nothing alarming. The kind of cases Seattle General saw 3 times a week, the kind of cases that required competence but not heroics. Dr. Pierce assigned zones and resources, his voice carrying the particular cadence of a man used to being obeyed. He got obeyed. This was partly because he was the ER director with institutional authority, and partly because something in his tone suggested that disagreement would be noted and remembered and factored into future scheduling and recommendations. Natalie was assigned to the pancreatitis case in Bay 3. A 42-year-old woman named Margaret who'd been admitted at 3 a.m. with severe epigastric pain radiating to her back, labs pending, NPO status active. Straightforward. The kind of case where a good nurse became invisible by being exactly what was needed. She moved toward Bay 3 without rushing, her badge clipped to her scrub pocket, her movements economical and purposeful. The ER smells shifted as she walked, less antiseptic, more the specific smell of a woman in pain, the sweat of fear and nausea mixing with the dried blood from the phlebotomy drawer. Natalie's breathing remained steady. She'd worked in an ER where the smell was copper and cordite and charred flesh, where patients were brought in missing pieces that couldn't be reattached, where pain was a secondary concern to triage. This was manageable. Margaret looked at her as she entered the bay, a small, relieved exhale as if the mere presence of a nurse was a comfort. "How are you feeling?" Natalie kept her voice level, professional, the carefully constructed tone she'd been using for 2 years. "Any change in pain levels since we last checked?" "Worse." Margaret's voice was hoarse from the nausea medications. "My back is killing me." Natalie nodded and checked the 4-line, the bag of normal saline hanging above the bed with its fluid dripping at the correct rate. The monitor showed tachycardia, 97 beats per minute, which was reasonable for pain levels this severe. She made notes in the chart with a pen that moved across paper with the same precision that her hands had once moved in a field hospital. Every entry perfect. Every detail recorded. 2 years of charts and not a single error, not a single ambiguity, not a single reason for anyone to question her competence. That was the deal. That was the invisibility. That was the price she'd agreed to pay. Dr. Pierce will have your labs in a few minutes, Natalie said. We'll know more then. She adjusted the foresight and stepped back. I'll be here if you need anything. Margaret nodded, grateful, and Natalie left the bay with the same quiet efficiency with which she'd entered. Back to the nurse's station. Back to the charts. Back to the work of being a person who simply existed in this space without disrupting anything or anyone. Dr. Pierce was making notes on a tablet, his stylus moving with aggressive precision. He looked up as she approached, and this time his gaze held longer. Hayes, he said. Your patient in Bay 1 yesterday. The trauma case. Natalie stopped. Waiting. Not defensive, not eager, just present. Your documentation was thorough, Dr. Pierce said, and the praise came out like an accusation. Perhaps overly thorough. I've never seen such detailed procedural notes from nursing staff. He needed careful monitoring, Natalie said. The response came smoothly. 10 words exactly. Every word selected. I documented what I observed. Dr. Pierce's eyes narrowed. I prefer my nurses to observe, not to analyze. There's a difference. She didn't respond. Response was negotiation, and she had nothing to negotiate. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds, and then Dr. Pierce turned away, dismissing her back to invisibility. But something had shifted. She could feel it the way a soldier feels the moment a sniper acquires a target, not a physical sensation, but a change in air pressure, a subtle recalibration of the space between them. He'd noticed her. After 2 years of perfect work and perfect invisibility, Dr. Pierce had finally noticed that something about her was wrong. And that wasn't invisibility anymore. That was being seen. The rest of the shift proceeded with the metronomic predictability of a busy morning in a mid-sized trauma center. Margaret's labs came back at 7:15, elevated lipase and amylase, confirming acute pancreatitis, no evidence of blockage on ultrasound. She was admitted to the medical floor. The 18-year-old with the compound fracture was wheeled out for orthopedic surgery. The MI risk patient was downgraded to an observation status. The 5-year-old was cleared of organ damage and released to her relieved parents. By 10 a.m., the chaos had settled into the kind of rhythm that made the ER feel almost like a normal hospital instead of a controlled disaster. Natalie floated between patients, documented everything with meticulous precision, answered questions without volunteering information, and made herself indispensable without ever being remarkable. This was her gift. This was her curse. This was her survival. But at 11:07 a.m., as she was reviewing a chart at the nurse's station, Dr. Pierce walked past and said something low enough that no one else heard. We'll be discussing your scope of practice in my office next week. After your shift. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He didn't ask if she was available. It wasn't a request. It was a command phrased as a scheduling announcement, and Natalie's jaw tightened just slightly, the only visible response, the only tell she allowed herself. She'd been trained by the U.S. military in weapons systems and tactical medicine and operational security. She'd been trained to make split-second decisions under extreme duress. She'd been trained to survive. But what they hadn't trained her for was how to maintain invisibility once someone had decided to look. Dr. Pierce had decided to look. That was when everything changed, though she wouldn't understand how much until later. That was when the clock started ticking toward something neither of them could control. For now, there was only the fluorescent hum of the ER and the weight of a folded flag sitting in a locker 17 feet away, waiting for a moment when the past would refuse to stay buried anymore. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer as Dr. Pierce held up a patient chart in the conference room, and 15 residents turned to look at the laminated pages like it was evidence in a murder trial. Natalie stood 3 feet from the back wall, her hands folded precisely at her waist, and watched him smile the way a prosecutor smiles before delivering the closing argument that will destroy someone's career. "This is what I call dangerous autonomy," Pierce announced, his voice carrying the particular contempt reserved for people he'd decided were beneath him. Nurse Hayes here decided to initiate a sepsis protocol without physician oversight. She diagnosed. She prescribed. The chart notation clearly states she recommended a broad-spectrum antibiotic regimen before I even saw the patient. He flipped through the pages with theatrical slowness. She practiced medicine without a license. The residents shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. One cleared his throat. Another found sudden interest in his own shoes. Natalie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only movement she permitted herself, the only concession to the fact that he had deliberately twisted her documentation. She had flagged the sepsis criteria. She had notified him. She had recommended evaluation, not ordered treatment. But the distinction didn't matter to Pierce. What mattered was that she had seen something he hadn't, and faster than he had, and that was a threat to the delicate ecosystem of his authority. I call her our little doctor, Pierce continued, and the cruelty in his voice was almost musical. Emphasis on little. He looked directly at her while he said it. Waited for a reaction. Got none. Extraordinary attention to detail, I grant you. But attention to detail without understanding the legal boundaries of nursing practice is simply recklessness with a clipboard. The residents laughed nervously, the kind of laugh that comes from people who understand they're being shown exactly what happens to those who exceed expectations. Natalie's hands remained perfectly still. Her breathing remained steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the weight of 18 years of training, of learning to hold herself together while receiving fire, learning to prioritize the mission over the wound, learning that showing pain was a luxury she couldn't afford. So she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply stood there and let him pour his resentment into the silence while the hospital's overhead system announced a bed availability in the ICU like background music. 3 days later, she was at the vending machine in the break room when she heard her name through the doorway. Natalie the know-it-all actually corrected Dr. Pierce's antibiotic order yesterday. Sarah's voice came from around the corner, followed by laughter that sounded like breaking glass. Jennifer's voice joined in, higher and meaner. Can you imagine? Like he didn't go to Harvard Medical School or something. Natalie stopped just outside the doorway, her hand suspended an inch from the vending machine button. She could see them now, the two nurses she'd considered friends, the one she'd covered shifts for, the one she'd stayed late to train. Sarah was leaning against the counter. Jennifer was perched on a stool, her legs swinging like she was in a coffee shop instead of a hospital break room where people came to cry between 12-hour shifts. And there, framed in the doorway behind them like he'd been standing there the entire time, was Dr. Pierce. Smirking. Watching Natalie's face like he was waiting for the moment she cracked. His presence was like cold air descending, like the pressure change before a storm, that sudden drop in oxygen that made everything feel dangerous and small. She thinks 2 years of night shift makes her smarter than a Harvard medical graduate, Pierce said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone who knew he had allies and the woman he was describing had none. More laughter. The kind that echoes in empty places. Natalie released the breath she'd been holding and walked into the break room. Her spine stayed straight. Her shoulders stayed back. The quiet confidence of someone who had held a scalpel in a field hospital under mortar fire doesn't disappear just because she's wearing scrubs instead of combat fatigues. She selected her coffee from the machine, dark roast, black, no sugar, and walked past all 3 of them without making eye contact, without changing her pace, without allowing her hands to shake once. She could feel Pierce's eyes on her back like a weight. She could feel his disappointment that she hadn't broken, hadn't cried, hadn't given him the satisfaction of seeing her wounded. By the time she pushed through the break room door, she could hear them laughing again, a little louder now, a little more certain, like hyenas who'd just realized their prey wasn't going to fight back. But that wasn't the worst part. That evening, during rounds, she was reviewing charts outside a patient's room when she saw it. A young man, mid-20s, with the kind of eyes that had seen things that statistics couldn't quantify. His chart said Corporal James Chen, transferred from Fort Carson Medical, presenting with acute respiratory distress and fever of unknown origin. She was 3 lines into his intake assessment when she recognized something that made her hands go completely still. He had the haunted look. The same one she'd seen in her own mirror after Kandahar. The same tremor in his hands when he reached for a water cup that came from doing her old job, the job that had gotten him shot. Twice in the chest. She could read it in the way his breathing changed when someone entered the room too quickly, in the way his eyes tracked exits before registering faces, in the involuntary flinch when a monitor alarmed suddenly. "This patient is oversedated," she said quietly, observing Pierce's notation recommending a benzodiazepine dose that seemed excessive for someone who was already presenting with respiratory compromise. Psychiatric evaluation might be indicated before pharmaceutical intervention. Pierce's face flushed a color that would have been funny if the stakes weren't what they were. "You're questioning my medical judgment." His voice had the texture of exposed live wire. "I'm calling security to have you removed from this floor. Right now." He didn't wait for her response. He simply reached for his phone with the certainty of someone who knew his calls would be answered, who knew he had the institutional weight to make problems disappear. Natalie looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, enough time for him to understand she wasn't afraid, and then she turned back to her charts. She said nothing. She made no argument. She simply returned to her work while he made his show of authority, while he spoke into his phone in measured tones about scope of practice violations and safety concerns regarding unsupervised nursing decisions. But Corporal Chen was watching this exchange with the kind of attention that came from someone who recognized authority the way soldiers recognize each other, not through rank insignia or name badges, but through the way they carried themselves when everything was burning around them. He was watching the way she didn't defend herself. The way her breathing never accelerated. The way she stood completely still while someone tried to destroy her and didn't flinch once. His fever-bright eyes tracked her as she moved through the room, and in those eyes, something shifted. Recognition. The kind that transcends paperwork and personnel files, the kind that comes from shared training, shared weight, shared ghosts. She could feel the machinery of his inspection working behind those eyes, could feel him assembling the pieces, the competence, the composure, the military bearing she tried so hard to bury under scrubs and protocol. And more than that, she could feel something else happening, could feel the moment when a dying man began to understand that there might be someone in this hospital who could save him, who had saved people in places where the geography was measured in grid coordinates and the language was blood and percussion fire. Dr. Pierce hung up his phone. He was still smirking. He had no idea that he'd just activated something that he couldn't control, that he'd just pulled a thread that would unravel everything he'd built. He walked back to the nurse's station with the confidence of a man who believed the world bent to his will, that authority was something you could grant or revoke, that the quiet woman who'd just questioned his orders was nothing but another problem to solve. Natalie returned to her documentation. Corporal Chen closed his eyes, but his right hand, the one with the tremor, reached out and touched the call button without pressing it, like he was testing to see if she was real, if Salvation had actually just walked into his room wearing a hospital badge and a 7-year-old trauma scar he would never see. The fluorescent lights hummed. The monitors beeped their mechanical heartbeats. Somewhere in the hospital, someone was dying. And Natalie Hayes, captain, former operator, current registered nurse at Seattle General in Colorado Springs, stood at the intersection between her buried past and the only future she'd been allowed to build, knowing that both were about to collide. The first sign was his hands. Tremor. Slight, controlled, the kind most people wouldn't catch, but Natalie caught it the moment Corporal James Chen's stretcher rolled through the ER bay doors with 2 penetrating chest wounds, entry and exit, the kind that meant Kandahar hadn't finished with him yet, just exported the work to Colorado. His eyes found hers across the controlled chaos of the trauma response, and she saw it there too, that specific hollow that comes from holding your unit together while your own chest is opening. The similarity wasn't metaphorical. It was muscle memory made flesh. Pierce was 3 bays over, supervising a pediatric head laceration with the careful precision he reserved for cases that would make good grand rounds material. Natalie positioned herself at Chen's bedside as the trauma team stripped away his field dressings, counted the damage, called out vitals in the shorthand that meant everything and nothing, BP dropping, oxygen sat adequate for now, consciousness intact but sliding. She'd seen this progression before. Knew what came next if nobody paid attention to the way his breathing was changing, shallow and quick, his chest not rising symmetrically. Right side wasn't expanding right. The tremor in his hands had moved from his fingers to his whole frame now, subcutaneous, the kind of shaking that happens when your body knows it's dying before your mind catches up. He was with 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, Chen's brother said from the corner, the only family member who'd come in, voice tight with the particular helplessness of civilians witnessing combat casualties on civilian ground. Sanjin Valley. 2 months ago. They said he was clear. He was clear. The word repeated itself like a machine with a stuck cycle, clear, 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 as if repetition could rewrite physics. Natalie didn't respond. She was watching Chen's color, the subtle blue creeping into his lips. Not cyanosis yet. Close. The shift change was happening in 4 minutes. The day nurse, Patricia, was already logging out at the computer station, and the evening crew was filtering in with the particular slowness of people who hadn't yet switched their minds from the parking lot to the ward. Pierce had finished with the laceration case and was walking toward the break room, his trajectory taking him past the supply station where he'd stopped to wash his hands, a 7-minute detail that would take him somewhere safe from liability while the patient in Bay 3 deteriorated. That was when Chen's breathing changed. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had flipped a switch. His chest went rigid. His mouth opened. No air moved. The monitor beside him showed a sinus rhythm that meant his heart was still pumping blood to a body that wasn't getting oxygen anymore, the worst kind of desynchronization, the body choosing to die in the most efficient way possible because something was blocking the space where his lungs needed to expand. Tension pneumothorax. She didn't need a chest x-ray to know. Didn't need Pierce's authorization. Didn't need the careful chain of command that said a registered nurse identified suspected tension pneumothorax and reported up the chain and waited while bureaucracy decided whether a doctor would believe her or take his time washing his hands. She moved. Hands reaching for the crash cart in the same motion, muscle memory older than her nursing license by 6 years, 6 years of field surgery intense, pressure bags used as hemostats, trauma shears cutting away field dressings with the confidence of someone who'd learned that hesitation killed people faster than bullets. The 14-gauge needle was exactly where it needed to be. She didn't announce it. Didn't call for permission. Just found the second intercostal space with her fingers, midclavicular line, a point on his chest she could have located in darkness under mortar fire and frequently had, and she pressed the needle through skin, through muscle, through whatever was holding back the pressure that was suffocating him from the inside. The hiss was instantaneous. Air escaping like a held breath released, the sound of pressure equalizing, the sound of a body remembering how to survive. Chen gasped, real air this time, chest expanding like someone had flipped the switch back, and his eyes rolled forward, suddenly present, suddenly alive, suddenly locked directly onto Natalie's face with the kind of recognition that doesn't come from introductions. His lips moved. One word, barely a whisper but shaped with absolute certainty, phantom. The monitor beside him climbed. Oxygen saturation rising from the crisis zone. 78. 84. 90. His color returned like someone was pushing color back into his face with a slow hand. The tremor in his body resolved into regular breathing. His brother made a sound, a broken exhale that meant survival had just become possible again. 30 seconds after that, maybe less, Dr. Pierce entered through the trauma bay door. His hands were still damp. Still carrying that soap smell, antiseptic and expensive, the kind that came from the physician's wash station with its special dispenser. He took in the scene in the manner of someone whose hierarchy had been carefully ordered since birth, the crash cart, the needle, Natalie standing perfectly still with her hand steady at Chen's chest, and Chen alive and breathing when the physics said he shouldn't be. Pierce's face underwent a transformation that would have been educational if it wasn't so clearly rooted in rage. Not gratitude. Not relief. The recognition that a nurse had just performed an invasive procedure that required physician presence in every protocol and regulation this hospital maintained, that Natalie had just demonstrated competence in a crisis that no amount of expensive hand soap could replicate, that she'd made him look slow and unnecessary in front of a trauma team and a family member and, most importantly, in front of himself. What did you do? His voice came out clipped and low, the kind of quiet that precedes consequences. Tension pneumothorax. Natalie's voice was steady, matter-of-fact, the voice of someone reporting a finding, not defending a choice. Right side. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. 14-gauge decompression. He would have arrested in under 2 minutes. Maybe 90 seconds once the rigidity fully set in. Pierce stepped closer. Close enough that the trauma team adjusted their positions, close enough that the room's energy shifted from stabilization to confrontation. You performed an invasive procedure without physician oversight. That's practicing medicine without a license. That's assault on a patient. Each word was shaped with the precision of someone who'd already practiced the accusation. You compromised the chain of command. You made a clinical decision that wasn't yours to make. Natalie didn't move. She was aware, in the way that operators are aware of everything, that Chen's brother was watching, that Patricia was still technically on shift and would be a witness, that this moment was being witnessed by approximately 7 members of the trauma team, all of whom could read the room well enough to understand that something larger than a medical decision was happening here. He was dying, she said. Just that. No justification. No explanation. Just a statement of fact that didn't require decoration. Pierce pulled his phone from his pocket. Not to review protocol. Not to consult the hospital's emergency procedure manual. She recognized the gesture because she'd seen it twice before, once during grand rounds when he'd looked at her charts, and once at the vending machine when he'd decided her existence was worth documenting. He was making a call. Not to the attending. Not to the chief of medicine. Straight to someone with enough leverage to make problems disappear. This is Dr. Pierce, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Seattle General, Colorado Springs, he said when the connection answered. His voice had changed again, shifted into the frequency of someone talking upward in a hierarchy. I need to report a serious incident. A registered nurse just performed needle decompression without physician authorization. Yes, the patient survived. That's not the point. The point is we have a rogue nurse operating outside her scope of practice, and I'm concerned about patient safety moving forward. Yes, I'll wait while you document that. The nurse's name is Natalie Hayes. Hayes. I believe this warrants an immediate investigation by hospital administration. He ended the call. Looked directly at Natalie. Smiled, a small, satisfied expression that said he'd just pushed a button and would now wait to see what fell. Within the hour, she'd been pulled from rotation and placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Within 2 hours, security had been stationed outside Chen's room with explicit instructions that she was not to have patient contact, not to speak with him, not to check on his status. Her badge access had been revoked. Her shift assignment had been deleted from the system. By the time she walked out through the ER bay doors where she'd entered that morning moving with deliberate invisibility, she was officially invisible in a different way, a potential liability, a name on a report, a threat that needed containment. The termination letter arrived the next morning by courier. Natalie was still in her scrubs, hadn't changed out of them, hadn't showered, had simply existed in her kitchen while her 7-year-old daughter moved around her asking questions that started with why and ended with confusion about why mommy was home at breakfast time when breakfast time was normally for work. The letter was printed on hospital letterhead with formal language about scope of practice violations, unauthorized procedures, and the immediate cessation of her employment pending the outcome of an investigation that would take months, maybe longer, maybe never resolve in her favor because investigations like this one didn't resolve, they just slowly buried what they were investigating. She set the letter on the table. Looked at her daughter's confused face. Thought about Chen's eyes. Thought about the word he'd said, phantom, spoken with absolute recognition, as if he'd known her before he'd ever seen her, as if her buried past had somehow traveled into his memory and was waiting for him to speak it aloud in a hospital that didn't know her at all. The phone call started at 2:30 in the afternoon, while Natalie was still in the break room pretending to eat a sandwich she couldn't taste. Dr. Pierce sat in his office with the door closed, the institutional phone pressed against his ear like a weapon. First call, Marcus Whitmore, hospital board chairman, who owed Pierce a residency slot back in 2003 and had been waiting 18 years for someone to collect. Marcus, we have a serious problem. A nurse with questionable credentials performing advanced procedures without physician oversight. I've documented everything. The voice on the other end, warm, then ice, said only, I'll make calls. Second call, the Colorado Medical Board, filed at 2:45. This is Dr. James Pierce, ER Director at Seattle General. I'm submitting a formal complaint regarding Natalie Hayes, RN. Pattern of dangerous autonomy, practice beyond scope, insubordination. I have comprehensive documentation. The board received 73 complaints per month. They would move on this one in 3 to 6 business days. Third call, an investigator named Holloway who specialized in credential fraud, referred by a colleague from Johns Hopkins who understood how to bury people in paperwork. I need an expedited investigation into credential falsification. The nurse's background doesn't add up. There are gaps. Holloway had 2 open cases and 3 pending depositions. He would be thorough. He would be slow. That was the point. Pierce set the phone down at 2:58 and smiled at the wall of his office. The medical board couldn't fire her, that required hospital action. The hospital board couldn't terminate her without cause, that required documentation. But an investigation? An investigation could drag for months, maybe longer, maybe forever. She would be suspended pending outcome. She would be radioactive to every hospital in Colorado. By the time her clearance came through, if it came through, the damage would be permanent. He'd seen it before. The quiet ones always broke. 2 days later, on a Thursday morning when Natalie arrived for her shift, the security guard at the employee entrance looked at her with eyes that had already decided. I'm sorry, Hayes. You're not on the schedule. She hadn't checked the schedule. She'd spent the last 48 hours in a fog of automatic motion, shower, coffee, sleep 2 hours, repeat. I work today. The schedule has me through Saturday. The guard shook his head. Administrative suspension. Effective immediately. You need to collect your personal items and leave the building. The words didn't land. They bounced off her like rounds off ceramic plating. Then her hands understood before her mind did, and they began to shake, and she locked them into fists so hard her fingernails drew crescents of blood in her palms. The guard called up to HR. 10 minutes later, a woman named Brenda Sherman appeared, 30 years in administration, compassionate eyes that had delivered this speech before, with a manila folder and the kind of professional sympathy that tasted like copper. Natalie, we've received a formal complaint regarding your credentials and scope of practice. Pending investigation, you're suspended without pay. This letter details the charges and your rights to respond. The folder was heavy. Natalie opened it there in the security office with fluorescent lights bright enough to burn. Colorado Medical Board investigation notice. Hospital credential review pending. Investigation timeline, 3 to 6 months. Possible outcomes, written warning, probation, license suspension, revocation. The words blurred. I saved a patient's life, Natalie heard herself say, her voice steady as stone, a stranger's voice. According to the complaint, you performed an advanced procedure outside your scope of practice and directly contradicted a physician's order. Brenda's eyes were sorry. Is there anything you want to tell me? Natalie thought about the truth, about her hands, about Kandahar, about everything she'd been ordered to bury and everyone who died helping her learn the skills that had just made her unemployable. She thought about explaining. She thought about the flag in her locker. Instead she said, no. She took the folder. She took the security escort to her locker while the day shift began, while nurses she'd worked with for 2 years suddenly needed to be elsewhere, while Dr. Pierce watched from the nurse's station with his arms crossed and satisfaction plain on his face like a scar. The flag came out of the locker smooth and heavy, 13 stars, the weight of Sergeant Sarah Martinez who died under Natalie's hands in a field hospital where the walls were canvas and the floor was Afghan dust and the alternative to saving everyone was watching them all die. Natalie folded the flag inside her personal bag. She walked past the ER entrance where she'd walked past it 5,000 times. She didn't look at Pierce. Her composure was a weapon now, her silence a choice, her refusal to break worth more than 1,000 accusations. 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. Not Thursday. She'd lost a day somewhere. Natalie sat at the kitchen table in the apartment she and Mia rented for $1,500 a month, still in the pajamas she'd put on Sunday, the termination letter spread across the wood like evidence. Investigation outcome pending. All employment benefits suspended. Severance contingent on non-disparagement clause. The phone had vibrated 17 times since Thursday, texts from nurses, calls from the shift coordinator, one message from Sarah at the vending machine that just said, "I'm sorry," which somehow made it worse. The folded flag sat beside the letter, 13 stars catching the afternoon light that came through the kitchen window at that particular angle that only happened in winter. Natalie touched it once, the way she'd touched it before every shift for 2 years, and the dam that had held since Kandahar cracked. The tears came so fast her vision blurred, her breath caught, her hands gripped the table edge until her knuckles went white. 48 hours of swallowing had ended. Every humiliation, every public mockery, every moment of Pierce's satisfaction, all of it came up now like blood. She cried the way she hadn't since Martinez died, the way she wasn't supposed to cry, the way soldiers don't cry when they're supposed to be strong. Her face in the window's reflection looked shattered. Her hands were shaking. After all the years, all the missions, all the training that taught her to compartmentalize agony into a box in her chest where it wouldn't interfere with mission execution, she was breaking now, not from enemy fire, not from loss, not from the weight of a dead teammate. She was breaking because she'd failed to disappear completely. She was breaking because the Pentagon had buried Captain Natalie Hayes so thoroughly that the only version left was a nurse, and even that version was being taken apart, thread by thread, by a man with a vendetta and a phone. The key in the lock came at 3:22. Footsteps, small and quick, and then the kitchen doorway filled with the presence of 7-year-old Mia, home early from school, half day for teacher conferences, still in her uniform dress with the collar crooked, her backpack too big for her frame. She saw her mother at the table and her face changed. Kids see immediately. Kids understand crisis in a way that takes adults years to admit. "Mommy." Her voice was thin, the way it got when she was scared. "Why are you home? You work today." Natalie's hands moved to her face, wiping tears that came too fast, her military training colliding with maternal instinct and losing badly. She tried to smile and failed. She tried to lie and couldn't. Her daughter knew her better than that. Mia walked to her mother slowly, the way you approach a wounded animal, and without speaking, she climbed into Natalie's lap. At 7 years old, she was still light enough for that, still young enough to think a hug could fix things. Her small arms wrapped around Natalie's neck, and she pressed her face against her mother's shoulder the way she did when she had nightmares. "Did you have a bad day at work?" she asked. Natalie nodded, unable to speak. "Did you help someone?" Mia pulled back enough to look at her mother's face with eyes that were too old, too aware, the eyes of a kid who'd moved 4 times and gone to 3 schools and learned early that the world was unpredictable. Natalie managed, "Yes." "Then you did good," Mia said with absolute certainty. "That's what heroes do. They help people even when it's hard." The words hit Natalie like shrapnel and like salvation both. She pulled her daughter close, breathing in the smell of her hair, apple shampoo, playground dust, the specific scent of love that was worth more than the flag, more than the investigation, more than every sacrifice she'd made to disappear. "You're right, baby," she whispered. "I did do good." The kitchen was silent then except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic in Colorado Springs and the sound of her own breathing finally becoming regular again. Mia stayed in her lap for 17 minutes while the light changed and the shadows on the wall began to stretch toward evening, and for the first time since Thursday, Natalie allowed herself to believe that maybe Pierce hadn't taken everything. Maybe the most important thing, this 7-year-old with her fierce certainty that heroes exist and her mother was one, maybe that couldn't be destroyed by a phone call or a folder or a man's resentment. But that wasn't the worst part. At Seattle General, at 3:43, Corporal James Chen opened his eyes in the ICU and asked the first nurse he saw a question that would change everything. "Where is she?" "The nurse who saved me." "Where is she?" 3 days later, the hospital's letter arrived on Natalie's phone at 6:56 a.m., a text notification that the board hearing had been scheduled for that afternoon at Seattle General. No context. No explanation of what they were investigating or who had requested it. Just a time, a location, and a requirement for her presence. She didn't call HR. She didn't ask questions. She showered, dressed in clothes that felt like armor, dark slacks, her white nurse's coat, the one thing that still smelled like antiseptic and purpose, and drove to the hospital she'd been escorted out of 72 hours earlier. The administrative corridor was empty. Fluorescent panels overhead cast everything in harsh white light. Conference room 3B was at the end of the hallway, its frosted glass doors closed, voices muffled behind them. Natalie sat on a bench outside, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. She'd sat like this before, quiet, still, the kind of invisible that comes from understanding that the less space you take up, the less target you present. Her daughter had asked why Mommy was sad. Natalie had said work was complicated. Mia had nodded with the acceptance of 7-year-olds and gone back to drawing horses. That small dignity, pretending for her daughter that this wasn't destroying her, had kept Natalie vertical for 3 days. At 1:14 p.m., a nurse wheeled a patient down the corridor on a stretcher. Corporal James Chen. His eyes were open. His chest was wrapped in white bandages, his left arm in a sling, but he was alive and conscious, and the moment his eyes found her sitting on that bench, everything in his face changed. His mouth opened. He tried to sit up and immediately winced, but his eyes never left hers, and when he whispered the single word, "Phantom," the sound was reverent, almost breaking. Her operational code name. The call sign from Kandahar that had been sealed in Pentagon files, buried in classified records, locked away behind the same government order that had made her disappear into civilian life. Only people who'd been there would know that name. Only people who'd seen what she'd done under fire would recognize it. The nurse pushing the stretcher stopped, confused by the patient's reaction. Natalie stood slowly. She didn't approach him. She didn't acknowledge the name aloud. But she met his eyes, and in that moment, something shifted. He wasn't just the trauma victim she'd saved. He was a witness. A piece of her true self, suddenly breathing and conscious in this sterile hallway. They wheeled him into a different room. Conference room 2A. Natalie heard his voice through the walls, at first shaky, then growing steadier, stronger. He was speaking to someone in authority, a hospital administrator, reading from something. Her citation. Her name. Captain Natalie Hayes, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Kandahar Province, 2014. The voice of a young Marine describing the Special Forces captain who had held his unit together under mortar fire, who had moved through their perimeter with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd already accepted her own death and therefore feared nothing. His hands shook as he spoke, according to the muffled sounds through the wall, but his words were clear. Precise. Honoring. The conference room door burst open. A 2-star general from Fort Carson stepped into the corridor in full dress uniform, his medals arranged in perfect ascending rows, Bronze Star, Silver Star, Navy Cross. His aide carried a leather briefcase. The general walked straight to Natalie on her bench, extended his hand, and saluted her. Not a casual greeting. A full military salute. His fist pressed to his chest, the gesture of one warrior honoring another. Captain Hayes, he said. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, low, immense, capable of shattering glass. Welcome home. Through the open conference room door, she could see Dr. Pierce standing at the head of a long table, his face already reddening. The board chairman was there, and the hospital CEO, and the credential investigator, and a Pentagon liaison in a dark suit holding a manila folder sealed with red tape. Pierce started shouting before anyone else could speak, that this was irregular, that military rank meant nothing in a civilian hospital, that he wouldn't be intimidated by uniforms or ceremonies, that she had violated protocol and endangered a patient, and no amount of medals changed that fundamental violation of civilian medical law. The general didn't raise his voice. He simply opened the folder the liaison handed him and began reading. Operation Sandstorm, Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. Captain Hayes provided emergency surgical intervention to wounded personnel under active Taliban fire, sustaining shrapnel wounds to her left shoulder while maintaining sterile field conditions. She performed 18 surgical procedures in a forward operating base over 36 hours with 0 post-operative infections despite austere conditions. Bronze Star Favela. A pause. Dr. Pierce's jaw was clenched now, his hands gripping the table edge. June 2014. Kandahar Province. Convoy ambush, IED strike. Captain Hayes conducted emergency field amputations using nothing but a trauma saw and a headlamp, saving 2 Marines who would have died from blood loss. Silver Star Favela. Another pause. The hospital CEO was reading something on his phone now, his expression darkening. December 2014. Captain Hayes absorbed shrapnel from an RPG strike while shielding a wounded soldier with her own body. Purple Heart. February 2015, Second Purple Heart. March 2015, Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire while performing emergency interventions during a coordinated attack on FOB Shank. The General closed the folder. That needle decompression performed at Seattle General 3 days ago? That is a procedure Captain Hayes has performed 47 times. In a hospital with a surgical suite, full anesthesia, an entire trauma team standing by, and no bullets coming through the windows. She didn't violate protocol, doctor. She saved a life using expertise your credential investigator had no framework to evaluate because that investigator has never been in a room where someone was dying and protocol doesn't matter. Only competence matters. Only survival matters. Pierce was on his feet now, his voice pitched high and wild, insisting that this was a witch hunt, that the military didn't get to decide what counted as civilian medicine, that he had followed proper procedure and filed proper complaints and your proper procedure was harassment, the CEO said quietly. The board chairman had already gathered his papers and left the room without making eye contact. Your proper complaints were investigated this morning by HR, and every documented interaction you had with Captain Hayes constitutes a pattern of bullying. The credential investigator you hired has already withdrawn from the case via email due to concerns about client motivations. We've reinstated Captain Hayes, effective immediately, with full back pay for the 3 days she was terminated. The board is formally apologizing for this miscarriage of justice. The Pentagon liaison slid a piece of paper across the table. Your sealed file has been updated to reflect her current civilian status as Natalie Hayes, RN. She's no longer under non-disclosure regarding her military service. That's now her choice. Pierce stormed out of the room, already on his phone before he passed Natalie in the hallway, yelling about witch hunts and lawsuits and how his mentor at Johns Hopkins would hear about this injustice. The general offered to buy her coffee. The CEO shook her hand. Corporal Chen, wheeled past in his stretcher, gave her a thumbs up despite the pain medication clearly working through his system. By evening, it was over. She was reinstated. She was real again. But Dr. Pierce was still talking to his mentor, still insisting on his version of events, still certain that his credentials from Harvard and his recommendation letters and his tenure on the hospital board meant something that would protect him. He was wrong. He didn't know that the medical student in Grand Rounds had filmed him, not just the moment when he'd held up her charts, but the vending machine incident where he'd smirked while colleagues mocked her. The student had posted the compilation online with a simple caption, "This is what bullying looks like in academic medicine." The video spread through medical professional circles like a contagion. Comments piled up. Hundreds of nurses and residents recognizing the type, the arrogant physician, the one who confused authority with competence, the one who destroyed people to maintain the illusion of his own brilliance. And his mentor from Johns Hopkins, the renowned physician who had spent 40 years advocating for patient safety and professional compassion, saw the video and released a public statement. Dr. Pierce's entire career was constructed on those recommendation letters. On his mentor's name. On the assumption that if he bore that endorsement, he must be trustworthy. The statement shattered that completely. I am withdrawing all recommendation letters I have previously provided and calling for a comprehensive review of this physician's fitness to practice. What I witnessed in that video contradicts every principle I have taught my students for the past 4 decades. I cannot, in good conscience, support the advancement of someone who demonstrates such cruelty to colleagues. The State Medical Board opened an investigation within 24 hours. Seattle General suspended his privileges pending review. The CEO personally delivered the news in Pierce's office, security escort, cardboard box, the slow walk through the ER past whispering staff. But unlike Natalie, Pierce's composure didn't merely crack. It shattered. He was shouting about lawsuits, about rights, about how they would regret this, his voice rising to the ceiling like something trapped and dying. The security guards exchanged weary looks and kept walking. At home that night, his wife asked quietly if the video was real. If that's really how he treated people. Pierce had no answer that didn't condemn him further. He poured himself a drink and didn't speak until morning. 6 months passed. Natalie walked through Seattle General's ER in her restored scrubs, her name badge reading a Natalie Hayes, RN, BSN with no rank, no explanation, that remained her choice. The folded 13-star flag from her locker, the triangle of fabric from her teammate who died on her surgical table in Kandahar, now hung mounted behind glass in the ER break room. The plaque beneath it read only one word, phantom. A reminder that some people carry their wars long after the shooting stops. That some people heal others while healing themselves. That the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. Corporal Chen visited during his recovery, healthy now, cleared to return to duty training combat medic stateside. He showed her photographs, his voice steady. "You taught me the job could be done," he said. "Even when it seems impossible." Through the ER bay windows on a Tuesday afternoon, Natalie saw a white medical supply van pull up to the loading dock. Dr. Pierce emerged in a company uniform, wheeling boxes of gauze and 4 supplies. His medical license remained under investigation. His academic career had evaporated. His future was now measured in delivery routes and vendor accounts and the slow erosion of whatever remained of his certainty that the world owed him respect. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. His shoulders were hunched. All his former arrogance had collapsed into bitter routine. Natalie watched him for exactly 3 seconds. Felt nothing. Turned back to her patient charts. A new resident approached nervously, asking about the needle decompression procedure that had saved Chen's life. Natalie explained with patience, demonstrating on a training dummy, teaching the way she wished someone had taught her before she learned under fire. Her voice had dropped an octave since the hearing. Her movements were precise, military, commanding. The voice transformation had completed itself. She was no longer the deferential nurse who accepted humiliation in silence. She was Captain Hayes again, wearing scrubs instead of fatigues, teaching instead of fighting, but commanding the room with the same absolute certainty that came from having already survived the worst. When her shift ended, she touched the phantom plaque once, gently, the way soldiers touch their fallen. Then she headed home to her daughter, to Mia's drawings and questions and the small dignity of being fully seen by someone who loved her. If you've made it this far, you know that sometimes the most heroic people aren't standing in the spotlight. They're standing in the hallway. Standing in silence. Standing with a courage so quiet that the world almost misses it. Subscribe for more stories of the ones who carry their strength invisible until the moment the world finally has to look. Leave a comment. What would you have done in Natalie's position? And if you know someone who's been underestimated by authority, who's held their ground when others doubted them, share this video with them. Because true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching.